Welcome to Early Indicators. Today we conclude our February domain on environmental tipping points with a theme that signals a profound shift in how governments, scientific bodies, and multilateral institutions are beginning to understand and manage global environmental risk. The emergence of planetary boundaries governance, frameworks built around ecological ceilings, biophysical limits, and climate risk accounting, represents one of the most consequential early signals of a new global environmental order. These developments are not headline-driven. They are signals in the clearest sense. Signals are structural, not events, early, not reactive, underreported, not mainstream, and directional, not episodic. They reveal where governance systems are beginning to adapt to a world defined by accelerating environmental constraints. To understand how we reached this moment, we need to trace the long arc of environmental governance. In the 1970s and 1980s, environmental policy focused on pollution control, conservation, and local ecosystem protection. By the 1990s, climate change entered the global agenda, but governance frameworks remained fragmented. The early 2000s brought the first attempts to integrate climate, biodiversity, and resource management, yet these efforts were limited by political and economic constraints. Over the past 15 years, scientific research on planetary boundaries, thresholds that define the safe operating space for humanity, has gained traction. As climate volatility, biodiversity loss, and resource depletion accelerate, governments and institutions are beginning to adopt frameworks that recognize ecological limits as central to economic and political decision-making. Several forces converge to create this inflection. Climate change increased the frequency and severity of extreme weather, exposing the limits of existing governance models. Biodiversity loss accelerated, threatening food systems and ecosystem services. Resource depletion strained global supply chains. Economic pressures revealed the cost of ignoring environmental risk. Scientific advances provided clearer evidence of planetary thresholds. Governance gaps became more visible as traditional policy tools failed to keep pace with environmental change. These forces reshaped macro-scale systems such as global trade, climate diplomacy, and economic planning, while also influencing micro-scale systems including local land use, community resilience, and corporate strategy. Current signals show the shift with growing clarity. First, several governments are beginning to incorporate planetary boundaries into national planning documents, recognizing ecological limits as constraints on economic growth. Second, multilateral institutions are exploring climate risk accounting frameworks that integrate environmental thresholds into financial regulation. Third, scientific bodies are publishing updated assessments of planetary boundaries, highlighting areas where thresholds are being approached or exceeded. Fourth, corporations are adopting internal carbon budgets, water use limits, and biodiversity metrics aligned with planetary boundaries. Fifth, new policy proposals are emerging that link environmental limits to trade agreements, investment decisions, and development strategies. These developments rarely dominate mainstream coverage, yet they reveal a system undergoing structural transformation. Signal confidence, emerging and converging. Here is where the shift is most visible. In the European Union, policymakers are exploring frameworks that integrate planetary boundaries into agricultural, industrial, and trade policy, signaling a shift toward ecological limit governance. In New Zealand, environmental accounting systems are being developed to track natural capital depletion and integrate ecological thresholds into national planning. In parts of Scandinavia, municipalities are adopting local carbon budgets and biodiversity targets aligned with planetary boundaries, influencing land use decisions and infrastructure planning. In multilateral forums, discussions are emerging about linking climate risk accounting to global financial regulation, revealing early signs of a new governance paradigm. These examples illustrate how planetary boundaries governance reshapes systems at every layer. Nations must reconsider economic planning, resource management, and climate commitments. Cities face rising costs as environmental limits influence infrastructure investment, land use decisions, and resilience planning. Firms encounter operational risks tied to resource constraints, regulatory shifts, and environmental performance requirements. Communities experience changes in land use, local economies, and environmental quality. Individuals face new expectations around consumption, resource use, and environmental stewardship. At the macro layer, planetary boundaries governance alters global trade, climate diplomacy, and economic strategy. It influences investment flows, regulatory frameworks, and geopolitical alignments. At the micro layer, it affects households, neighborhoods, small businesses, and local ecosystems. The fragility revealed is profound. Economic systems built on assumptions of unlimited resource availability are colliding with a world defined by ecological limits. Future expectations point towards several trajectories. In the short term, over the next 1 to 3 years, more governments and institutions will explore planetary boundaries frameworks, and early policy pilots may emerge. Corporations may adopt internal environmental thresholds to manage risk. In the medium term, over 3 to 10 years, planetary boundaries governance may influence trade agreements, financial regulation, and national planning. Resource constraints may reshape economic strategy, prompting shifts in energy, agriculture, and manufacturing. In the long term, beyond 10 years, planetary boundaries governance may redefine global economic architecture, prompting new forms of cooperation, competition, and regulation. Entire sectors may reorganize around ecological limits, and new governance institutions may emerge to manage global environmental risk. Early indicators to watch include national planning documents referencing ecological limits, corporate adoption of planetary boundaries metrics, multilateral discussions on climate risk accounting, and scientific updates on threshold status. Potential tipping points include the formal adoption of planetary boundaries frameworks by major economies, the integration of ecological limits into global financial regulation, and the emergence of new governance institutions dedicated to managing planetary thresholds. What to watch next? Pay close attention to regions and institutions where environmental limits are being linked to economic planning, financial regulation, and trade policy. These clusters often signal where planetary boundaries governance will accelerate first. Watch for early policy pilots, corporate commitments, and scientific updates. These developments can reveal where the next phase of global environmental governance will unfold. In summary, the emergence of planetary boundaries governance is one of the most consequential environmental signals of our time. It reshapes economic planning, climate policy, resource management, and global cooperation. It reveals fragilities in systems built on outdated assumptions about ecological stability. And it offers early insight into where environmental governance will evolve in the coming decades. These signals are quiet, but they are deeply consequential. Thank you for listening to Early Indicators. If you found this episode valuable, please like, subscribe, follow, and share. Your support helps bring attention to the signals shaping our future. This episode draws on publicly available information, including international think tank reports, academic research, public climate and policy data, open-source intelligence, and non-copyrighted summaries of global developments. No proprietary or confidential sources were used. This episode is for informational and educational purposes only. It does not constitute political advice, financial guidance, or predictive certainty. All interpretations are based on publicly available information and are intended to support general understanding of global trends.